I want to introduce you to a wonderful practice called Tonglen. It's a Tibetan practice, a beautiful practice that really honors the Bodhisattva way of giving. Often we do this if we're not feeling well, if we have some physical problem, if we have a stomach ache, a headache, migraine headache, or the flu. A few days ago I had the flu for a day, and when you have the flu, the first thing that happens for most of us is I thoughts, right? We're thinking like, I have the flu, I feel weak, I have a headache, I'm feeling run down, I'm feeling tired, I'm sneezing and coughing, I have a sore throat. And we're just thinking about all these symptoms that we have that make our body feel very unpleasant, and in pain and suffering. So this makes us feel miserable, right? We feel miserable with the flu. So Tonglen is a practice that changes all of this completely, turns it totally upside down. The reason that we're feeling so miserable and suffering is because our attention is on me. It's on I. It's on this sense of I that's suffering. That's why we're feeling so miserable. So in Tonglen, what we do is we realize that if we have the flu, there's 7 billion people in the world. There are probably many people that are having the flu, experiencing the flu right now at this same time. Maybe millions of people are experiencing the flu at this same time. Many people just in the United States alone. And we begin by feeling, maybe some people that we know or that we've seen or anybody that we know that's sick, or we can imagine, that we've met before and imagine that they might be sick. And breathing in all those suffering symptoms and breathing out healing to them. Breathing in all their suffering symptoms and breathing out healing to them. So we're giving, we're breathing, we're taking in all their suffering, and we're breathing out, giving healing to them. And as we keep doing this, we expand the number of people. Beyond people with the flu, there are sick people who are dying, confined to a bed. There are people who have, lost the ability to walk. There are people who have just lost a child. There's people in war-torn countries. There are people who are starving to death. There are people who have just been abused or raped, or whose families have been killed. There's so much suffering in the world. So it's easy to understand that there is this, and we breathe in all their suffering too. Breathe in all their suffering, and breathing out healing, peace to all of them. Breathing in all their suffering, and breathing out healing to all of them, to all beings. So we start with a few, 20, 100, and then we keep expanding it until we're feeling all beings. Not even just human beings. There's animals that are treated in terrible conditions, that are raised for slaughter. And while they're being raised, they're kept in small pens. Chickens that are cooped up in tiny little cages and never allowed to move. Cows that are kept in these very tight, confined quarters and never allowed to go out or see the sun. All of this, all this suffering that all these creatures are feeling, and we breathe in all their suffering and breathe out healing and peace to them too. All beings suffering, the suffering of all beings, and we breathe out this peace and harmony and healing to all of them. So as we do this sense of I is completely gone. There is no longer a sense of I. We're only focusing on this vast, infinite number of beings, which we are not separate from. And as we do this practice, we realize this. We directly experience that we're not separate from them. as we continue doing this practice. If you've never done this before, it may take a while. You may practice for a while to work your way up to this. But eventually it works, and you're completely aware that you're not separate from any being. Your heart goes totally open to all beings. All beings are included as you're breathing in. All beings are included in your heart. And as you breathe out, you send your heart out to all beings. You send out this healing energy to all beings. And you realize that you are not separate from any of these beings. You are one with all of these beings. And that feels wonderful. That feels wonderful. No matter what kind of symptoms you have, what kind of suffering, what kind of pain you have before you begin this practice, it pales in comparison to how good it feels to be one with everything, to realize your true oneness with everything, to let go of this sense of a separate I, which happens naturally in this practice. It's just overwhelmed by the sheer magnitude of all these beings. And you're giving, you're receiving them into your heart and giving out from your heart to all of them. It just completely dissolves, overshadows, outshines any sense of I at all. So you're left with this great feeling of love, this enormous field of love. And you started with these painful symptoms and this I-based suffering, and you end up with this enormous field of love. And often you find, as I always do, that whatever symptoms you had are gone when you're done. You sort of check and go, what happened to the flu? How did this go? Right? You're actually, in some way, you're healing yourself in this, because you are one with all these beings. You're just not focusing on yourself. You're completely not focusing on yourself. And in that, you're letting go of all this misery. And somehow physical healing actually happens in this as well. But that isn't the point of it. That's not the point of it. If you do it saying like, this is my way to get rid of my physical symptoms, it's not going to work. You're still too attached to the I. You're still too focused on the I. You have to surrender that and give to all these beings. Allow all these beings to come into your heart and send healing out to all these beings. That's what you need to do. That's the way this healing happens. It's a bodhisattva way. It takes attention completely off you and puts it on the reality that you are not separate from all beings throughout all existence. You are not separate from any of them. This is reality. So we begin with our imagination, just sort of imagining this, imagining these beings. It's not hard, right? You know there's a lot of beings in the world. You've seen pictures. You've met people. There's a lot of beings in the world. And you know that there's a lot of suffering in the world. Unless you live under a rock, you realize that there's a lot of suffering in the world. Humans are suffering. Animals are suffering. There's a great deal of suffering going on in the world. You realize this. And so this is, you give your heart out to heal that suffering. Your intention is to heal that suffering. So in the beginning, you're using your mind, you're using your imagination to do this. But pretty soon, this reality of your non-separation takes over. Because this is truth. You come into truth beginning with your imagination, and by doing that, by your heart completely giving to these people, completely taking in all this suffering into yourself and sending out healing to them without worrying like, oh, I don't want all that suffering of other people. I've got enough of my own. You don't think that. Forget about that. That's just I-centered things. Do it anyways. Keep doing it anyways, and the I-centered focus will fall away by itself. You'll stop being afraid. What if I contain all this suffering in me all the time? Well, it's not going to be that way. You already are not separate from any of these people that are suffering. If one person, somewhere in Africa is starving, you are starving. You're not separate from anyone anyways. That's the reality. You're not separate from anyone anyways. You never have been. That's just this illusion of a separate self. That's just this fundamental delusion that humans have about being a separate self. This is not reality. It's just a dream. So by doing Tonglen, by doing this practice, you realize directly the truth of life. You realize directly reality. And that feels good. That feels wonderful, to be in touch with reality. You can tell in the beginning when you start this off and you're concerned about your symptoms, your problems, your suffering, how miserable you feel, how terrible that feels. You know, it feels horrible to be focused on this limited sense of I, particularly when the body is sick, you know, ill and in pain. That's where the misery is coming from. It's not really coming from the illness or the pain or the suffering of the body or that. It's coming from this sense of I am suffering. This illusion of the I, that's where all suffering comes from. So when you send it out to others, when you take the focus off of you, off of this separate sense of I, and put it onto all beings, in giving to all beings, that sense of I falls away, and with it, all suffering. That's why you're not suffering anymore. You feel one with all beings, and all suffering is gone. It doesn't really matter what's going on with the body. If you have flu symptoms, you might still have them. For some reason, often these symptoms are also gone. I can't explain why that happens. It has always happened with me, but I can't explain why that happens. But the beautiful thing is, it doesn't matter if they're still there or not, because you're not going to suffer as long as you're feeling one with all beings. It doesn't matter what's happening to your body. You're still not going to suffer. The body's going to do what it does. It gets sick at times. At some point, it's going to die. That's just the way bodies are. But you don't have to suffer. And Tonglen is a way to show you to have the direct experience of where your suffering comes from and how to be completely free of it.